If you'd like to vote on the next general to be covered, please join the Patreon page for as little as $1 and you can cast your ballot. If you like what I do, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already, join the Patreon page, and purchase something from one of my online stores. Every little bit helps. Thank you. The afternoon of July 3rd, 1863, defined and brought to a climax the largest battle on the North American continent. It also defined one man's life in particular. George Pickett, along with other division commanders from James Longstreet and A.P. Hill's respective corps, advanced on the Union position on Cemetery Ridge, outside the little Pennsylvania town of Gettysburg. The attack, known as Pickett's Charge, bears George's name, though he was by far not the only one involved. Pickett's Charge has come to define George Pickett and brought his name immortality, though he failed in the attack. It was the last great gasp of the Army of Northern Virginia during its second invasion of the North, and became known as the high water mark of the Confederacy. Through a hail of lead and iron and an effusion of blood, George Pickett's name lives on in the history books and brings people from all over the world to the fields over which his division of Virginians marched toward immortality. George Pickett was born on January 25, 1825 in Virginia. His family immigrated to what would become the United States in the 1600s, and by the time George was born, settled outside of Richmond, Virginia. Virginia was a tumultuous place in the early 1800s. The constantly cultivated plantations and farms on the eastern side of Virginia produced fewer and fewer crops. Soil depletion wreaked havoc on farmers and planters alike. George's father, Robert Pickett, was faced with a decision regarding making a living. He could try to eke out a living in Virginia or move west where some of his family traveled to, but Robert decided against a move. With his farm not yielding what he hoped, his investment in slaves became a burden, so he got rid of over half of them, entered into the coal business, and began to rent out his property in Richmond to gain additional income. That was the world George was born into. The young man was talkative and boisterous, with a ready laugh and a melodious voice. He loved to hunt, sing, and dance. His mother Mary called him indolent, and he certainly was, preferring play over work. Warned by poor health and the premature death of 5 other children, Mary became apprehensive about these perceived flaws in her son's character. She fretted over his lack of self-reliance and discipline, direction and ambition. She wondered if he would ever mature into a respectable gentleman. To attempt to shape George into an upstanding gentleman, the family sent him to Richmond Academy, but his time there only lasted 2 years. His family could no longer afford the high tuition. Additionally, George disrupted classes and reveled in pulling pranks. He always looked for a way to overcome his restlessness, and it usually resulted in disobedient and disrespectful behavior. In 1839, Mary and Robert decided to send George to live with Mary's brother, Andrew Johnston, who had earlier moved to Quincy, Illinois. Andrew quickly became a prominent citizen in Quincy, joining a local law firm, serving as the treasurer of the town, and joining the Whig Party. Mary and Robert hoped that the enterprising Andrew would influence George to become an upstanding gentleman. In Illinois, Pickett behaved exactly like he had in Virginia, dancing, hunting, and smoking. He even joined a local theater group. His uncle brought him into the law firm to study law and hopefully pass the bar, but Pickett showed little interest in the law. In 1840, seeing no great change in their son, Robert and Mary suggested George should enter West Point Military Academy. Both Robert and Andrew were officers in their local militias. They viewed the military as an opportunity for George to structure his life accordingly. To get into West Point, he needed a congressman to appoint him. Andrew's newspaper supported the Whig politician John T. Stuart, the law partner of Abraham Lincoln. Andrew's influence allowed for him to ask Stuart to nominate his nephew to the academy. In the summer of 1842, George completed his entrance exam, signaling that although he lacked obedience in school, he learned enough to be competent in the subjects that West Point tested appointees on before entering the school. Within 3 days of him entering the academy, Pickett accumulated 3 demerits, foreshadowing his less than spectacular record at West Point. He would average 165 demerits each year. Those demerits came from various things like late for roll call, using profane language, marching out of step, being improperly dressed, and visiting after hours. Pickett frequented Benny Haven's temptingly close tavern. He loved alcohol, and as one of his classmates declared, Pickett was a devoted and constant patron of Benny Havens. On one occasion, another classmate found Pickett drunk and lying in a snowdrift. The classmate saved Pickett from frostbite and possibly expulsion by rescuing him from the elements. At the end of his first year, he stood 218th out of the entire student body of 223. His academics wouldn't improve. In 1846, he graduated 59th out of his class of 59, dead last. Those in his class included George B. McClellan, George Stoneman, Thomas Stonewall Jackson, Dabney H. Maury, Darius Couch, Cadmus Wilcox, Jesse Reno, and David R. Jones, to name a few. Pickett wouldn't be able to get a position in the engineers or the artillery with his low standing. He preferred to go into the dragoons, and one of his aunts even wrote to the Secretary of War that her nephew would be more fit for the dragoons because of his horsemanship. The letter didn't make a bit of difference. He was going into the infantry. The Mexican-American War erupted the same year as Pickett's graduation. General Zachary Taylor led an army into Mexico, and the West Point cadets in the class of 1846 were anxious to get to the front, hoping to win glory for themselves. The summer furlough began after graduation, and Pickett went back to his family in Virginia to await his orders. When July came and he had yet to receive his orders, he got worried. Then he found in a newspaper that he had been assigned to the 8th U.S. Infantry. Now he panicked. He hadn't received the official word from the War Department and hadn't been given instructions as to where to meet his new command. All those papers were sent to Quincy, Illinois, the location of his appointment to West Point. The matter was settled eventually, and Pickett got the information he needed. He set off for Matamoros, Mexico, but broken steamers, low water levels, and other obstacles delayed him. He arrived on November 9, 1849, 2 months late. His commanding officer requested a written explanation for his tardiness. Pickett missed the important battles in northern Mexico, but another opportunity arose for this recent graduate. President James K. Polk agreed for General Winfield Scott to land an army at Veracruz, an important Mexican port, and strike for the Mexican capital. Pickett would be transferred to Scott's army, but he found military life dull. He spent his days drilling new recruits, a monotonous and difficult job, breeding contempt for volunteers. Pickett was assigned to William J. Worth's division and arrived at Veracruz to help bring the city into American hands. His unit was also part of the first troops to enter into the city of Veracruz after its capitulation. The army pressed on to Jalapa. Along the road, they fought the Battle of Cerro Gordo and then pressed on to Puebla to take a 3-month rest while waiting for reinforcements. Compared to active campaigning, the respite at Puebla must have seemed monotonous to Pickett. However, he still found time and money to have a good time. West Point classmate William Gardner remembered meeting Pickett on the streets of Puebla one afternoon in May 1847. Combat had not diminished Pickett's love for a good time and a stiff drink. He revealed a 50-cent piece and invited Gardner to join him for a mint julep at a nearby bar. Thirsty and empty-handed officers quickly surrounded the two men when they entered the bar. Gardner admitted that he felt guilty, realizing that juleps cost 25 cents each. In a moment that recalled his days on the Quincy stage, Pickett rapped for attention and loudly announced, "Fellows, I have asked Gardner to take a drink, and I am simply bound to have one myself. Now, if anyone can squeeze any more liquor out of that coin," he declared, throwing the 50-cent piece on the table, "let him step up and imbibe." The two men drank unmolested by the crowd of onlookers. In August 1847, the reinforcements arrived and the army began to move again toward Mexico City. At the Battle of Contreras, Pickett took little part in the engagement, but he and the rest of his comrades cut a path through the lava beds in pursuit of the Mexican army who were defeated at the battle. At the Battle of Churubusco, Pickett had one of his hardest battles thus far and his most standout performance. The Americans repeatedly attacked a fort that guarded the Churubusco River. The Americans attacked piecemeal for about 3 hours until a concerted effort to take the fort started in motion, with Pickett's 8th U.S. Infantry supporting the 6th in the attack. The men, without scaling ladders, charged across a 20-foot wide water-filled ditch to the 15-high-foot walls. The 8th was the first to plant their colors on the ramparts of the fort. Pickett's superiors cited him for excellent conduct in the taking of the fort, and he received a brevet promotion to first lieutenant. On September 8, 1847, Pickett participated in the Battle of Molino del Rey, where he was on the American right, taking part in the bloody assaults that yielded little results, until American artillery opened up a furious barrage and helped push the Mexicans away from the area. Again, Pickett was cited for his abilities on the field. A few days later, Scott planned to assault the fortified castle of Chapultepec. Scaling ladders and courage drove the Americans up against its fortified walls and entrenchments. As Pickett himself maneuvered up the dangerous ground, another West Pointer, not too far removed from the academy, named James Longstreet, was carrying the American flag. Longstreet went down with a wound to his leg. Pickett grabbed the flag and with one arm climbed the ramparts and pushed on into the fortified area, aiming for the flagpole. He tore down the Mexican flag and replaced it with Old Glory. He would receive another brevet promotion for his actions at Chapultepec. As one of Pickett's biographers explained, to young officers like Pickett, war in Mexico meant male companionship, conquering a dishonorable and inferior enemy, and gaining recognition from comrades and officers. It meant frontal charges and flanking attacks that always succeeded, and daring feats that always brought glory. For George Pickett, the Mexican War was raising that flag over Chapultepec. In the midst of death and suffering, he had found his life's calling. As Pickett made his way back to the port of Veracruz, he stopped off at Jalapa and brought along his cousin, Henry Heath, also in the army, to have a good time. According to Henry Heath, they painted the town red before leaving. Following the Mexican War, Pickett was stationed for a short time at Jefferson Barracks in Missouri, close to St. Louis. It was there he learned more of his role as an officer in an infantry company and regiment. The barracks could be a little dull, but St. Louis afforded the soldiers a source of entertainment. Pickett also became sick during this time at the barracks, and his father attempted to use his political connections to bring Pickett home to recuperate, but his attempt failed. By the end of 1848, Pickett received his new orders. He would be heading to Texas for duty on the frontier, building roads, escorting civilians through hostile areas, and setting up military installations. In the post-Mexican War political climate, the U.S. government cut the size of the regular army, which meant that the soldiers in the service needed to do extra duty. Pickett traveled all over Texas, visiting various installations like Forts Bliss, Gates, Clark, and Chadbourne. He wrote at Fort Chadbourne, "We manage to exist, but it is scarcely more than an existence." During this stint on the frontier of Texas, Pickett got married. It's uncertain when he began his courtship with the daughter of prominent Virginia planters, but by late 1850, the two set a date for the wedding in late January 1851. Pickett received a 60-day furlough and met Sally in Louisiana, and in the town of Franklin, at the St. Mary's Episcopal Church, they were wed. They honeymooned at the St. Charles Hotel in New Orleans, Louisiana. They probably married in Louisiana because they feared that his leave wouldn't cover the needed time to travel to Virginia. Plus, Sally's sister and brother-in-law lived near Franklin, Louisiana, on a plantation, so she had family in the area. After the honeymoon, Pickett requested an extension to his leave, and husband and wife traveled to Virginia. 6 weeks before his leave came to an end, it appears that he was ready to return to Texas. He wrote to the War Department that if any companies of men were headed to Texas, he was ready to join them. His eager movement back to Texas probably came because Sally was already pregnant, and he knew that if they waited much longer, she wouldn't be able to make the journey, so they decided to leave early, to be able to make it to Texas and settle in. They moved into Fort Gates, but her time there was short. Sally died giving birth on November 13th, 1851. The child didn't survive. Both bodies were shipped back to Richmond to be buried in the Pickett family cemetery. Pickett applied for another furlough to grieve, and although he received the time off, he took an extra few weeks unauthorized leave. During that absence from the Army, he traveled to Virginia. It was on the Virginia shore that Pickett met a little girl, just about 9 years old, named LaSalle Corbell, or more commonly known as Sally. Sally came from a planter family like Pickett, but less well off. She was suffering from whooping cough, and she noticed the officers standing at the shore. She introduced herself, and they struck up a conversation. Pickett told her that he was depressed because he had just lost his wife and child. He told the little girl that his wife's name was Sally, and she was delighted that both of them had the same name. The two built sandcastles, and according to her, he gave her a ring with a gold heart with the inscription Sally on it. By May 1852, Pickett returned to his command, now garrisoning Fort Johnston on a fork of the Concho River. By the end of the year, he moved back to Fort Chadbourne. His time back in Texas was one of misery as he continued to mourn his wife and child, but his family worked tirelessly to get him a promotion. Robert Pickett continued to use his political connections to try and get his son a promotion since the Secretary of War, Jefferson Davis, had been authorized to expand the Army. Robert obtained a letter of recommendation from James Longstreet, one of Pickett's friends from the Mexican War. Longstreet wrote that at Churubusco, Pickett was particularly distinguished as one of the most gallant officers on that field. I was near him throughout the day and can safely say that more conduct and gallantry was not exhibited by an American officer during the Mexican War. Robert continued to get petitions signed by Army officers and letters written by prominent politicians in his battle to get his son a promotion to captain. It worked, and in March 1855, Pickett became a captain in the 9th U.S. Infantry. He was to report to Fort Monroe in Virginia. He didn't arrive until August 1855, but his family was happy to have him within a day's ride of the family plantation. He spent from the time of his arrival until December training new recruits. He now commanded a whole company himself, and when December came, Pickett left Fort Monroe, spent 4 months in Florida, then began the long journey to the Washington Territory by boat around the tip of South America. The territorial governor of the Washington Territory was Isaac I. Stevens. He attempted to get the local Native Americans to sign treaties and be moved to reservations. Thousands of white immigrants descended on the territory and put pressure on resources, and when gold was found at Fort Colville, the flame of war ignited. Native Americans attacked gold seekers on their land, and when a government agent came to investigate the murders, the Yakima cut his throat. When some U.S. Army regulars began to retaliate, they barely escaped with their lives, thus beginning the Yakima War. This was the environment which Pickett entered when he landed on the shores of the Washington Territory. In March, Pickett took part in a fairly large-scale engagement with Native Americans on the White River. The enemy fled and a tenuous peace ensued. Then he and his company moved 100 miles north to Bellingham Bay, where more violence arose between whites and other tribes. When Pickett arrived, he found about 30 settlers crowded into a stockade in a crude fort named Fort Defiance. The soldiers began building a more defensible fort that they named Fort Bellingham, which included a sutler store, barracks, and other necessities for Army life. Pickett claimed military necessity and confiscated 300 acres of land adjacent to the fort. When the couple who owned the land refused to leave, they were forcibly removed from their land. Pickett promised to pay the owner, but the paperwork got bogged down in the War Department, and the residents never received their payment. The monotony of Army life and the allure of nearby gold resulted in a high desertion rate. Between August 1856 and December 1858, over 50 men of his small command deserted. Pickett interacted with Native American groups, even learning their language, in order to communicate with those he dealt with. He even became sensitive to the situation of the Native Americans. One scholar hypothesizes that since many Army officers thought similarly, that this was because many white settlers espoused animosity toward professionally trained soldiers, and that those officers began to look on Indians as someone they needed to protect. Pickett felt this way, not that he saw them as equals to himself, but almost had a paternalistic view of them. Nevertheless, he still dreaded fighting them in combat because of their irregular style of tactics. When a white settler is brutally massacred, Pickett remained supportive of the Indians. Although recommending punishing the guilty tribe, he noted that among Puget Sound Indians, great dissatisfaction is rising in the fact that their land is being continually occupied by the whites and no remuneration or attempt at it. He criticized the insecurity of white settlers of the Sound toward any inroads made by northern tribes. Some Whatcom residents accused him of overstepping his bounds by using soldiers to police civilians and by attempting to shield Indians from what he deemed as white exploitation. Although the details are uncertain, Pickett had a relationship with a Native American woman named Morning Mist. Since her group was the reason that Pickett was ordered to the territory because of their attacks on white civilians, it's believed they came together to help stabilize the relationship between the two groups, but Pickett most likely just wanted female companionship. It's not believed they were legally married by Euro-American tradition, although some insist they did, but it is thought that they were married in the Native American tradition. They lived together, and in December 1857, Morning Mist gave birth to a son they named James Tilton Pickett. Morning Mist passed away soon after giving birth. Pickett gave James to a white family in another county. Then he applied for a leave so he could travel back to Virginia, which was granted in June 1858. Just like when his first wife passed away, George took leave from the Army. He traveled to Virginia and New York City. On July 21, 1858, he wrote to the War Department requesting a 6-month extension to his leave, which was granted. At the end of 1858 and the beginning of 1859, Pickett returned to Fort Bellingham in the Washington Territory. The area was still contested between the United States and Great Britain, and when the territory was created, it didn't clearly establish the boundary between the two nations, and San Juan Island was one of those contested areas. In July 1859, Pickett was ordered to build a post on the San Juan Island. The British Hudson Bay Company allowed their hogs to run freely all over the island. In June, an American named Lyman Cutler found one of those hogs rooting through his tater patch and chased the animal and eventually shot it dead. The pig's owner, Charles Griffin, refused the money Cutler offered to pay for the pig. The refusal allegedly came after Cutler claimed he had rather shoot the owner than the pig. Griffin wanted Cutler prosecuted by the British government, but Cutler claimed the animal hadn't been killed on British soil. The now famous Pig War had begun. When Pickett's commander in the Department of Oregon ordered him to build a post on San Juan Island, it was to safeguard American settlers as well as secure the interests of the United States on the island. The commander also gave Pickett essentially independent command of the area. Pickett jumped at the chance to gain recognition. He quickly got to the island and issued a proclamation stating, "This being United States territory, no laws other than those of the United States, nor courts except such as are held by virtue of said laws, will be recognized or allowed on this island." Pickett was immediately confronted by the British, and a British war steamer came very close to the island in preparation for hostilities. Pickett defiantly told the British that he was ordered there by the U.S. government, and only an order from them would send him away. However, the confidence was most likely a show. As time ticked away, Pickett got more worried. He wrote to his commander's adjutant, Alfred Pleasanton, "You know I am a peaceable man, but we cannot stand everything." As the small American force was being surrounded, Pickett agreed to a meeting between the belligerents to discuss peace negotiations. The British offered a fair resolution that the two nations would occupy the island until civilian authorities could settle the issue. Pickett refused that offer. Soon more troops were brought to the island from the American side, numbering about 450 men. With the influx of troops came officers, and Pickett no longer was the commander of the post. The British weren't looking to escalate the tensions. Napoleon III's campaign in Italy threatened European stability, and the last thing Britain wanted was a war with the United States. When President James Buchanan heard about the tensions, he was astonished. He immediately sent word to the British government that the commander of the department had acted without his knowledge, and proposed a way to settle the matter. Buchanan also dispatched Winfield Scott to the territory to assess the damage. He arrived on October 20, 1859, with the intention of keeping the peace. Scott agreed to the joint occupation of the island, and Pickett was sent back to Fort Bellingham. By the spring of 1860, with Scott gone, the departmental commander ignored Scott's orders for a joint occupation and ordered Pickett back to the island. Scott finally removed the departmental commander, which cooled tensions. Pickett acted as a sort of constable, maintaining order on San Juan Island. When a white man killed an Indian outside of a brothel, Pickett got restitution paid to the Indian family and put into rest any threat of an avenging raid by the Indian's family. With the election of Abraham Lincoln at the end of 1860, Pickett, as well as other Army officers, had a decision to make: side with the Union or the Confederacy. Pickett wrote to another Army officer that, "I myself come from a Union-loving state," but he argued that Virginia and other outer border states cannot make their voices heard. He condemned the Republicans who, in their pride and flush of victory, will not listen to the terms proposed by the conservative element from those good and true states. However, he was equally critical of the fire eaters. "I do not like to be bullied or dragged out of the Union by the precipitatory and indecent haste of South Carolina." In June 1861, Pickett received orders to report to California to possibly put down a Confederate outbreak in that state. Virginia had already seceded, but when he was ordered to California, he decided to resign from the Army. The fact that he waited so long may indicate that he was satisfied remaining in his adopted territory of Washington, but when he found he was going to have to fight against a possible Confederate threat in California, that may have convinced him to join his birth state. Pickett's son James was left in the care of the Collins family and his son's namesake, James Tilton. Pickett gave Tilton $100 for being so kind to look after his son. Pickett didn't even say goodbye to his son before he left. He did leave his son a Bible and his Army papers so the little boy would know who his father was, but when Pickett left the Washington Territory, his child would never see him again. Pickett's future wife claimed in her post-war writings that Pickett was followed by government agents when he resigned and had to wear disguises and travel with a companion to elude the federal authorities. She also claimed he re-entered the country through New York City and traveled through the Midwestern states into Kentucky, then Tennessee, and on to Richmond, Virginia. Plenty of Army officers left the U.S. Army without being followed in such a way, so her claims are probably fabricated. He got to Richmond in September 1861 and offered his services to the Confederacy. Within the span of about a week, Pickett was given the rank of major in the artillery, then captain in the infantry, and finally a promotion to colonel and the responsibility of commanding the lower Rappahannock River. While the main Confederate Army in Virginia sat north of his position, Pickett guarded the lower end of the Rappahannock River. A few scares and reports of Union gunboats approaching his position came in, but those turned out to be false. The scariest moment for Pickett was when he realized that the locals and some of the troops placed under his command were likely to side with the Union, as Unionist sympathy pervaded parts of the area he commanded. A greater portion of our loyal men, the chivalry and high-toned gentlemen of the country, have volunteered and are far from their homes. There is a strong element among those who are left either to be non-combatants or to fall back under the old flag. I cannot close this communication to the General Commandant without saying that many more complaints were made by a certain class of population than are warranted. We have to fear them most. All during a war like this must suffer, but for the good of the general service, it will not do to yield to those persons who have refused to volunteer, while the proprietors of the country are actually in the field, and who plead poverty and would join the enemy should an occasion occur. It will be a mistaken leniency and would only lead to further trouble. The Confederate War Department finally sent a regiment of Virginians under Colonel John M. Brockenbrough to Pickett, after Pickett personally went to Richmond to find out what was holding up the reinforcements. However, there was a problem. Brockenbrough was senior to Pickett, outranking him and basically making Pickett's presence void. Amazingly, Pickett was removed from his position along the Rappahannock and promoted to Brigadier General in February 1862. Pickett may have simply benefited from being at the right place at the right time. He was an unattached colonel with formal military education and real, if limited, combat experience. Johnston's main army at Centerville suffered from chronic shortages of general officers to command brigades, one of which was composed entirely of Virginia troops. President Davis normally insisted that brigadier generals be from the same state as the men. Pickett's visit to Richmond may have brought his name to the forefront and highlighted his availability at the most opportune time. By February 28th, Pickett joined Joseph E. Johnston's Army of the Potomac around Centerville, commanding a brigade in James Longstreet's division. Pickett and Longstreet had been friends for a long time, and when 3 of Longstreet's children died around this time, it was said that Pickett made the funeral arrangements because Longstreet and his wife Louise were too distraught to do so. Pickett had a short distance to report to Johnston from his position on the Rappahannock, but took him over 10 days to make the journey. One historian believes he was courting LaSalle Corbell, the young lady he had met on a Virginia beach many years ago, following the death of his first wife. Whether that delayed him or not, their courtship began to burn brighter around that time. Pickett was with Johnston's army only about 3 weeks before the army commander decided he needed to withdraw to protect his supply lines. The wet spring made the march south a miserable quagmire for officers and men alike. The first major stop for Pickett was at Culpeper Courthouse. At that location, bits and pieces of Johnston's force were sent to the peninsula formed by the York and James Rivers, where the Union Army of the Potomac was landing. That force under Major General George McClellan planned to march up the peninsula and threaten Richmond, the Confederate capital. Johnston held Longstreet's division back at Culpeper Courthouse. While there, Pickett inspected his troops, and when he came to a young man in line, he took his rifle and ran a white gloved finger over the barrel of the weapon. When Pickett finished rubbing his finger along the barrel, the glove showed a rust streak. The young man's colonel stepped in and said that this young man had come from the North to support the South. Pickett took out a handkerchief, blew his nose, and turned away without saying a word. The young man recalled, "It was a little mortifying to be pointed out as this young man, and stared at without even a nod of recognition, but alas, all the patriotism in the world wouldn't count in the scale of a West Pointer with 1 or 2 degrees of higher rank, however the great equality in all other respects." Soon the threat was too great from the Union Army on the peninsula, and the rest of Johnston's force moved from Culpeper Courthouse to Yorktown. Pickett's men sat in the trenches in that wet spring, with water sometimes standing a foot deep in their fortifications. During the siege of Yorktown, Pickett's men saw their commander's temper firsthand. When some Union soldiers took a redoubt that was lightly manned, Pickett noticed a nearby artillery battery standing around idle, letting the Union have their way with the position. Captain James Deering, commander of Pickett's artillery, recounts the story from there. Pickett is not noted for keeping his temper, so he ripped out with a whole handful of pretty strong words and told them that he ranked Colonel Brown and was in command down here just then, and if they didn't fire they had better leave. Longstreet soon arrived and backed up Pickett's argument. Johnston pulled his army back up the peninsula in the face of McClellan's 100,000 troops. At Williamsburg, to give the supply train ample time to make it to safety, the Confederates turned on their pursuers, with Longstreet's division taking a very active part in the Battle of Williamsburg. Pickett's men fought bravely with their commander by their side. After the battle, Longstreet reported that Pickett, greatly distinguished in other fields, used his forces with great effect, ability, and his usual gallantry. Despite his good performance, Pickett was concerned over the battle. During the engagement, he witnessed a colonel get shot down when he halted his men after seeing a white flag of surrender. I must mention also the dastardly subterfuges of an enemy pretending to surrender in order to stop our fire to allow their reinforcements to come up and enable them to pour in a deadly volley upon an honorable and too unsuspecting foe. The Confederate army kept trudging on toward Richmond, and McClellan pursued. The Union army pushed so close to the capital that they could tell time by the church bells ringing. Unfortunately for the Union army commander, he had essentially split his army in half, with part of it north of the Chickahominy River and the other half south of it. Johnston viewed this as a great opportunity to destroy a good segment of the enemy. During the opening part of the Battle of Seven Pines or Fair Oaks, Pickett's brigade took no part. As the battle was starting to go against the Confederacy, Longstreet sent Pickett forward and put him under command of Daniel Harvey Hill. When Pickett arrived at the front, a Confederate Zouave soldier from Louisiana came rushing into his lines on the back of a mule. Pickett stopped him and asked what the problem was. The Louisianian stated that the enemy was just ahead and he was trying to save his own life. Pickett was disgusted at the actions of the man, but soon a mob of rebel soldiers came bursting through the woods in his front, just like the lone rider before. Hill gave Pickett orders to move forward, and he did, excited at the chance to attack the enemy and drive them away. From Pickett's perspective, his men performed beautifully, pushing aside everything in front of them, but in reality Pickett was entering into somewhat of an inverted V formation in the Union line, and when he entered it, a deadly crossfire began to rip into his ranks. He rode to Hill and asked for help, but Pickett was essentially on his own. But he was stubborn and didn't want to fall back. He stayed at the front for nearly an hour before having to pull back. With the fight at Williamsburg and now Seven Pines, Pickett's reputation within the army was that he was an aggressive and dependable commander. The brigade would gain a nickname as well, the Gamecock Brigade. In the fight at Seven Pines, Joseph E. Johnston was seriously wounded. Robert E. Lee would assume command of the army and name it the Army of Northern Virginia, the name it would carry to the end of the war. For about a month, Lee prepared his army for a series of attacks to drive McClellan back down the peninsula. Those attacks would be known as the 7 Days Battles. For the first day, Pickett's brigade was held back and didn't engage, but at Gaines' Mill, Pickett threw his men into the fight amidst a terrible storm of musketry and artillery. In one of the attacks, a staff officer noticed Pickett fall from his horse. I did not perceive his fall until he said to me, in very expressive terms that somebody had hit him. I immediately dismounted, examined his wound, and found the hole of a minie ball in his shoulder. In her post-war writings, Sally Corbell, Pickett's wife, would write of him heroically, telling a surgeon to take the ball out of his shoulder right there, and telling the doctor that he must go to the front to help his brigade. Major John Cheeves Haskell wrote that he passed by Pickett, who was standing by his horse in a deep small hollow, almost like a well, bewailing himself. He called to me to send a litter as he was mortally wounded. I had none and was too busy with my men. He was very slightly wounded and perfectly able to take care of himself. The wound incapacitated Pickett enough that he stayed in Richmond, cared for by Sally, while the Army of Northern Virginia fought at the Second Battle of Manassas and Antietam. Upon the Army's return to Virginia, following its first invasion of the North, Lee reorganized the Army. With this reorganization, there came a demand for brigade and division commanders. On November 6, 1862, Pickett was promoted to Major General. As in the past, a combination of personal connections, good fortune, and circumstances seemed again to push Pickett's military career forward. In reality, he lacked demonstrated experience to warrant such a promotion. Pickett had little time to savor his promotion. After 4 idle months, he commanded 15,000 battle-worn veterans. By December, Pickett found himself again on the banks of the Rappahannock River, but instead of being a colonel, he was now Major General. The Union Army of the Potomac now confronted the Army of Northern Virginia outside of the town of Fredericksburg, Virginia. In this enormous battle, Pickett and his men were little more than spectators, watching the repetitive blue tide surge against the Confederate works. Both armies began to settle in for a mostly quiet winter, but in February 1863, Lee detached Pickett and his division to the south side of the James River in anticipation of a Union push up the peninsula again. He didn't remain there long before Longstreet arrived to take command of Pickett's division and the other troops in the vicinity and move on Suffolk, Virginia. Moxley Sorrell, Longstreet's assistant adjutant general, recalled Longstreet and Pickett's relationship. Taking Longstreet's orders in emergencies, I could always see how he, Longstreet, looked after Pickett and made us give him things very fully, indeed sometimes stay with him to make sure he did not get astray. Moxley added that Longstreet was exceedingly fond of Pickett. Longstreet moved Pickett and John Bell Hood's divisions to Suffolk to lay siege to help protect Richmond and to gather food to send to Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. Pickett was in close proximity while at Suffolk to the home of Sally. By April, he was on the Confederate right near the Dismal Swamp. He would leave his troops almost every night to visit Sally at Barber's Crossroads, where Sally stayed with her aunt. Longstreet became irritated at the constant request by Pickett to go visit Sally. Pickett saw these irritations in his interactions with the corps commander. So Pickett decided to ask Moxley Sorrell, a member of Longstreet's staff, for permission. Sorrell declined. Pickett begged, but he is tired of it and will refuse, and I must go. I must see her. I swear, Sorrell, I'll be back before anything can happen in the morning. Despite the denial of Sorrell, Pickett went to see Sally without permission. While outside of Suffolk, a cavalry officer was resting on a fence when the fence rail broke, and he came crashing down on a sleeping Pickett, wrapped in an oilcloth. His waking was unceremonious, and cuss words filled the air. Pickett was then about 35 or 36 years old, short and fat with a red face, mustache, and imperial. He was a free liver, but never drank to excess when on duty. Colonel Eppa Hunton, of Pickett's division, remembered, "In riding with Pickett along his lines with his staff, we came to an exposed position, and to my surprise, General Pickett and his staff laid flat down on their horses' necks. Hunton was shocked and angry, and felt this was a poor example for the men in the ranks. The disgusted colonel rode with Pickett bolt upright in my saddle. Hunton claimed that Pickett was a gallant man, but his courtship and eventual marriage to LaSalle Corbell somehow changed him. Up to the time he was married, Hunton maintained, I had the utmost confidence in his gallantry, but I believe that no man who married during the war was as good a soldier after as before marriage." Hunton believed that marriage during the war seemed to demoralize men. Around this same time, the Confederate War Department suggested sending Pickett's division to Braxton Bragg's Army of Tennessee in the Volunteer State, then to send him to John C. Pemberton at Vicksburg, Mississippi. Robert E. Lee shut down both of those ideas, preferring to keep Pickett with Longstreet in order to secure food for the Army of Northern Virginia in preparation for the spring and summer campaigns. There's no indication that Pickett knew about those discussions, but he would have been completely satisfied to stay near Suffolk, near his sweetheart Sally. If you like what I do, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already, join the Patreon page, and purchase something from one of my online stores. Every little bit helps. Thank you. Pickett wouldn't get to stay near his sweetheart Sally for long. At the end of April and the 1st of May, his corps commander James Longstreet was ordered to bring his 2 divisions back to Northern Virginia to join Robert E. Lee in the Army. Although he hadn't captured Suffolk like he had hoped, Longstreet's occupation of the area garnered a great amount of food for the Army. Pickett and the rest of Longstreet's corps arrived too late to take part in the Battle of Chancellorsville, which resulted in the wounding of Thomas Stonewall Jackson. Although John Bell Hood's division and Longstreet would quickly move to Lee's support, Pickett and his troops stayed behind, moving around Richmond, keeping an eye out for a Union threat against the capital. He maneuvered around that part of Virginia for more than a month before receiving word to fix 3 days' rations, but no route was mentioned. Lee sent a message to Pickett to forward wagons to Newton, but when Pickett couldn't find the location on any of his maps, he telegraphed Lee asking him to clarify where he meant, but he got no reply. Frustrated, he wrote to Brigadier General Arnold Elzey in Richmond that he had telegraphed immediately to find out what place was meant. As usual from those headquarters, received no reply. Pickett and his men were at Hanover Junction when some Union raiders threatened King William County. Pickett was ordered to deal with the threat, but the enemy slipped away. Lee got angry at Pickett. He wrote to one of his new corps commanders, A.P. Hill, "I feel Pickett did not go far enough. I have telegraphed him that he must drive them back." As Lee assembled his army for his second invasion of the North, Pickett traveled northward, but 2 brigades less. His brigade of South Carolinians and a brigade of Virginians were left behind or detached. All he had with him was the brigades of James Kemper, Richard Garnett, and Lewis Armistead. He worried about the strength of his command, writing to his superiors that he now commanded the smallest division in the army and requesting for his brigades to be sent to him, but to no avail. In the summer of 1863, Pickett was 38 years old. To white Southern men, Pickett seemed a strange mix of femininity and masculinity, a dandy in uniform. Staff Officer Moxley Sorrell offered a typical description: a medium-sized, well-built man, straight, erect, and in well-fitting uniform, an elegant riding whip in his hand. His appearance was distinguished. But Sorrell added, it was Pickett's hair that made him memorable. Long ringlets flowed loosely over his shoulders, Sorrell wrote, trimmed and highly perfumed. His beard likewise was curling and giving out the sense of Araby. Another member of Longstreet's staff, Raphael Moses, recalled Pickett as dashing, yet foppish in his dress, a man who wore his hair in long ringlets. Arthur Freemantle, an English visitor with Lee's army, similarly observed, he wears his hair in long ringlets and is altogether a desperate-looking character. By June 30th, Pickett was near Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. He put his men to work destroying railroad infrastructure. In the early morning hours of July 2nd, messages from Lee got to Pickett instructing him to proceed to Gettysburg. The previous day a battle had erupted, and now Lee wanted his entire army concentrated around the little Pennsylvania town. He didn't arrive in time to take part in the vicious fighting on the second day of the battle, but Longstreet assured him that he would have plenty of work for him the next day. The morning of July 3rd was one of excitement for Pickett, who could barely contain himself. Lee decided to strike at the center of the Union line on Cemetery Ridge, following an artillery barrage of around 150 cannons that began around 1 p.m. The infantry attack would consist of Pickett's division and 2 divisions from A.P. Hill's corps. Hearing of the battle from his position at Chambersburg the previous day, Pickett thought he would miss out on another fight and another opportunity to gain fame, but the thrill of the attack on this now 3rd day of the battle excited him. Cavalry General Fitzhugh Lee remembered Pickett riding past him saying, "Come on, Fitz, and go with us. We shall have lots of fun there presently." Longstreet ordered Edward Porter Alexander, the commander of the artillery that was to soften up the Union position, to begin the bombardment until the enemy appeared weakened or demoralized. When that moment arrives, Longstreet wrote, Advise General Pickett, and of course advance such artillery as you can use in aiding the attack." Pickett knew nothing of this exchange. As Union cannon fire loudly answered the roaring guns of the Confederates, he continued to feel confident and sure of victory. At one point, Alexander went to Pickett to feel his pulse, as it were, about the assault. Alexander later recorded, "He was in excellent spirits and sanguine of success." Around 1:30 p.m. it appeared that Union gunfire had measurably slackened. Alexander even spied Federals wheeling the guns to the rear. He immediately dispatched to Pickett, "If you are to advance at all, you must come at once, or we will not be able to support you as we ought." For a passing moment, Pickett's feelings of confidence left him, and the old uncertainties reappeared. Using precious time, he rode with Alexander's note to Longstreet. His friend and commander read the note without a word. Pickett scanned Longstreet's face, looking for signs of encouragement or reassurance. Seconds ticked by. Pickett asked, "General, shall I advance?" Longstreet could not speak. He nodded and turned his head so as to avoid Pickett's eyes. Pickett stiffly straightened and saluted. "I am going to move forward, sir." The veil of pride and cockiness returned. Pickett mounted his horse and rode toward his division. A few minutes later, another note came from Alexander. "For God's sake, come quick, or we cannot support you. Ammunition nearly out." Pickett rode to his division, straight up in his saddle, took off his hat and yelled to his men, "Up, men, to your posts! Don't forget that you are from old Virginia." Then he yelled out the preparatory command, "Forward." The orders echoed throughout the ranks of his 3 brigades, and they stepped off. It was about 3 p.m. Pickett, as a division commander should do, led his battle line toward the enemy, but as division commanders were expected to do, he stopped about 400 yards from the enemy, let his men pass, then monitored his battle line, riding from right to left. He stayed close to the Cadore barn for a while as the chaos reigned over the battlefield. Reports that Pickett shirked his duties or hid behind a tree are false. He did as any major general in combat would do. While his men attacked, he sent one of his aides to Longstreet, asking for support. The corps commander believed the attack hopeless, but dispatched a brigade under Cadmus Wilcox to Pickett's right toward the Virginians' position. Pickett sent repeated couriers to Wilcox, urging him to bring up his brigade. Captain Robert Bright then brought it to Pickett's attention that the left flank seemed to be in trouble, and Pickett told Bright, "Ride to Deering's battalion. They have orders to follow up the charge and keep their caissons filled. Order them to open with every gun and break that column and keep it broken." As the minutes ticked by, Pickett's men were slain, waiting for artillery and infantry support. Pickett's division melted away before his eyes. An artillery officer named William Pogue encountered Pickett soon after the repulse. He rode toward Pickett and said, "General, my orders are that as soon as our troops get the hill, I am to move as rapidly as possible to their support, but I don't like the looks of things up there." Pickett didn't say a word, just stared at the battle-torn field. Pogue persisted, "What do you think I ought to do under the circumstances? Our men are leaving the hill." Pickett finally spoke, saying, "I think you had better save your guns." Then he rode away. Longstreet then came to Pickett, where the division commander exclaimed, "General, I am ruined. My division is gone. It is destroyed." Longstreet attempted to console him and tell him that everything would be right again. Next, General Lee approached Pickett. The distraught Pickett said, "General Lee, I have no division now. Armistead is down, Garnett is down, Kemper is mortally wounded." Lee responded, "Come, General Pickett, this has been my fight, and upon my shoulders rests the blame." Lee didn't renew the attack and ordered the army to march back into Virginia. After the disastrous defeat in what became known forever as Pickett's Charge, they were relegated to escorting prisoners. Pickett felt it a humiliation to subject his men to such duty after what they had done on July 3rd, and took his complaint to Lee. "No one grieves more than I at the loss suffered by your noble division in the recent conflict, or honors it more for its bravery and gallantry, and that he regretted assigning them the task but to do his duty." In Pickett's formal report, he heavily criticized other officers and bemoaned what he and his men endured. It was so defamatory that Lee allegedly made him destroy the report, saying, "We have the enemy to fight and must carefully at this critical moment guard against dissensions which the reflections in the report would create." Sally received a bundle of letters in mid-July. Pickett wailed about the travesty befallen his division, writing, If the charge made by my gallant Virginians on the fatal 3rd day of July had been supported, or even if my other 2 brigades had been with me, we would have been in Washington and the war ended. The animosity between Pickett and Lee was growing. Sally recalled that after Gettysburg, Pickett told her, "The future is uncertain, and it is impossible for me to call a moment my own. Again, with all the graves I have left behind me, and with all the wretchedness and misery this fated campaign has made, we would not wish anything but a very silent, very quiet wedding, planning on the sacrament and blessing of the church, and after that, back to my division and to the blessing of those few of them who by God's miracle were left." The 2 wanted to get married as soon as possible, and the date was set for September 15, 1863, in Petersburg, Virginia. However, since none of them were residents of the city, they needed a special court decree. They got married in St. Paul's Episcopal Church, with a crowd of thousands cheering them after the event. According to Sally, they then went to Richmond by train to a reception where President Jefferson Davis and his wife Varina attended. Robert E. Lee's wife gave the Picketts a fruitcake. After the wedding, Pickett was assigned to command what would become the Department of Southern Virginia and North Carolina, with his headquarters at Petersburg. As a departmental commander, his troops were repeatedly taken from him and distributed to other departments and armies. At the end of 1863, Pickett received reports that Union forces were moving into his department, freeing slaves and enlisting black men into the army, using those new troops to combat Confederate forces. Another report came in that Union Brigadier General Edward Wild took 2 women hostage and put them in irons as retribution for the Confederates holding a black Union soldier. To combat this problem, Pickett issued an order to hang anyone caught burning houses or mistreating women. The raids continued in an attempt to stop irregular warfare by guerrillas. Wild decided to make an example out of one of the captured Confederates. Private Daniel Bright, although he was an enlisted member of the Georgia Cavalry, Wild executed him and left him hanging from a post. Pickett got reports of the atrocity and wrote, "It makes my blood boil to think of these enormities being practiced, and we have no way of arresting them." A week after Bright's execution, Union citizens of Pasquotank County, North Carolina, told federal officials they found the body of a black Union soldier hanged, with a wooden placard around his neck. The placard read, "Here hangs Private Samuel Jones of Company B, 5th Ohio Regiment, by order of Major General Pickett, in retaliation of Private Daniel Bright, Company L, 62nd Georgia Regiment, hung December 18, 1863, by order of Brigadier General Wild." Pickett soon got word that he was to attack and capture New Bern, North Carolina, a town that fell to Union hands in early 1862 during Ambrose Burnside's North Carolina expedition. Pickett assembled 13,000 troops and 14 ships in late January for the assault. He planned for a 4-pronged attack against the fortified town. However, some of his officers, Seth Barton in particular, was slow to move at the appointed time because he was convinced the enemy heavily outnumbered him. After 2 days of trying to prod his men to fight, the element of surprise was lost, and he decided to withdraw his troops altogether. George Pickett's actions and words over the next several weeks seemed to show a man on the edge of despair. Little in this war had gone the way he planned. These battles were not the sort of honorable fighting he had envisioned as a young cadet at West Point, nor what he experienced as a hero in Mexico. Rather than offer an affirmation, this war brought personal attacks on his manhood, strained relations with his superiors, and seemingly senseless death and destruction. Simple frontal assaults did not succeed, and the enemy ignored rules of war. An outlet for his frustration came soon after his inglorious retreat from New Bern. On the New Bern expedition, Pickett received 22 North Carolinians as prisoners. Those 22 men had been a part of the North Carolina State Guard, but when they were threatened to be drafted into Confederate service, they joined the Union. Pickett viewed them as deserters, hanging all 22 of them after they were court-martialed. Union General John Peck reached out to Pickett about conducting themselves by the rules of war and informing him of Abraham Lincoln's proclamation that the Confederates should treat the captured black soldiers as any white soldiers. Peck also asked about Pickett's responsibility in the hanging of the black soldier named Samuel Jones. Pickett denied any part in the hanging, but coldly responded that if he had caught any black soldier who had killed an officer, soldier, or citizen of the Confederate States, that he would have executed him immediately. Pickett then added that for every Confederate soldier hanged, he would hang 10 U.S. soldiers. After the expedition, an uptick in Union raids caused concern for the Confederate War Department. Braxton Bragg, the new military advisor to President Davis, requested that Pickett stay vigilant and to keep him informed of all movements of the enemy. Pickett took this literally and began sending him every report that came across his desk, whether it had any validity or not. The influx of papers became so great that Bragg wrote back, "I must warn you of the evil resulting from exaggerated and unreliable reports." By April 23, 1864, the Confederacy replaced Pickett with Pierre-Gustave Toutant-Beauregard as departmental commander. Pickett still remained in Petersburg, being the district commander for the town. The once proud division commander now pleaded to be transferred back to the Army of Northern Virginia. It was granted, but Beauregard came down with an illness and turned command back over to Pickett, the very same day that Union forces, constituting the Army of the James around 30,000 men, began moving toward the capital. Seeing the movement of Federal boats and troops, Pickett fired off numerous telegrams to Richmond on May 5th, but no response came. It appears that Pickett was the boy who cried wolf. He had written so many messages about the movement of Union soldiers that now he wasn't believed. He finally sent a message reading, "I have sent you numerous telegrams this morning and failed to obtain an answer. The emergency is so great that I sent a courier by train to say that the enemy in force are coming up the river. You had better send troops." Bragg took the telegram, scribbled the word "seen" on it, and filed it away. The next day, the War Department sent Major General Daniel Harvey Hill to help Pickett in his department. It didn't ease Pickett's mind at all. The Virginian collapsed on May 10th from all the mental and physical exhaustion as a result of anxiety over the approaching Federals and running around Petersburg rounding up civilians to protect the city. He was confined to his room. Through deception and mustering as many troops as possible, he was able to delay the approaching Federals enough to get substantial reinforcements to the city, but it came at a serious cost to his health. With Beauregard at Petersburg and able to take command, Pickett traveled to Hanover Junction north of Richmond and joined his old division at that location on May 19, 1864. During the Overland Campaign, as Ulysses S. Grant battered Robert E. Lee's army from the Rappahannock and Rapidan rivers to just outside of Richmond, Pickett's division remained as kind of a mobile reserve, not seeing much action during the entire campaign. By mid-June, Grant and the Army of the Potomac, along with the Army of the James, began their operations against Petersburg, Virginia. In the division's first major action of 1864, Pickett rushed to secure the Howlett Line, a series of entrenchments at Bermuda Hundred. His actions in mid-June helped prevent the Army of the James from capturing the only rail line running from Petersburg to Richmond, prolonging the war by forcing Grant to try to capture Petersburg. Once the Howlett Line was stabilized, Pickett and his division settled into trench warfare, occupying that line of entrenchments from June 1864 until March of 1865. Now, parts of his division were dispatched to areas east of Richmond and toward Petersburg, but Pickett's duties remained protecting the Howlett Line. Pickett and Sally welcomed their first child into the world in the summer of 1864, a boy they named George Jr. Men of the division clamored for a chance to hold the baby. Sally remembered, "I am ashamed to confess it, but notwithstanding the gentleness of the soldiers, baby's quiet, peaceful mind, and the general's continued assurance that he was all right, I, his very new and solicitous mother, suffered agonies of torture and anxiety until he was back again in my arms. And oh dear, what a greasy, dirty, grimy little bundle it was when I did get it back." From November 1864 to March 1865, Pickett's division suffered an incredible amount of desertions. In less than a 10-day period in March of 1865, 10% of Pickett's force deserted. On January 19, 1865, Lee wrote to James Longstreet of his deep dissatisfaction with the conditions in Pickett's division. In one brigade, Lee chided, the Articles of War were seldom read, accommodations for the sick bad, and religious exercise neglected. He labeled another unsoldierly and unmilitary, lax in discipline, and loose in military instruction. Lee suggested that Pickett and his officers were not sufficiently attentive to the men and not informed as to their condition. Lee warned Longstreet that unless the division and brigade commanders are careful and energetic, nothing can be accomplished. Pickett was Longstreet's responsibility as a subordinate and as a friend. Lee directed Longstreet to do all in his power to correct the evils in Pickett's division. In late March 1865, Grant was determined to oust Lee from his Petersburg defenses and maneuvered cavalry and infantry to the extreme Confederate right to force Lee's hand and abandon the city. Lee dispatched Pickett's division to the Confederate right. Pickett met with Lee where they discussed the operations to throw back Grant's attack. It's unclear why Lee chose Pickett to command the operation. Lee didn't have much faith in Pickett's ability, yet he was given command of his own division, 2 brigades from Bushrod Johnson's division, and some cavalry. Pickett left Petersburg and marched for nearly 18 hours on March 30th to a crossroads called Five Forks. The men were worn out, and Pickett decided to wait until morning to launch an attack. The next day, Pickett launched an attack that was slightly mismanaged, with the cavalry attacking before the infantry was ready, but Pickett drove the enemy from the field, toward Dinwiddie Courthouse. However, in an odd move, Pickett halted his men. Sunset was coming on, but many of his men believed there was plenty of time to make the battle more complete for the Confederacy. Nevertheless, the men halted, and Pickett dug in along White Oak Road. The next day, on April 1st, between noon and 1 p.m., Pickett left his command, traveling 1 mile to the rear of his position to take part in a shad bake put together by cavalry officer Thomas Rosser. Many of his men didn't know he had left the field or where he had gone when the Union forces launched their own attack against their hastily thrown-up line. Union General Philip Sheridan threw a huge infantry force against the Confederate position, caving in the left flank of Pickett's line. Pickett remained unconcerned until he witnessed 2 couriers that he had sent to the front get captured in front of his eyes, as the Union had made their way a mile into the Confederate rear. When a messenger from the cavalry tried to give Pickett a report, Pickett kept riding, saying, "Don't talk to me." Pickett's presence at the front did him no good as his men began running for the rear. Thousands were picked up as prisoners. Would Pickett's presence at the front from the beginning have prevented disaster? Probably not. The numbers were too overwhelming, but his actions were definitely negligent. The Union victory at Five Forks led to a breakthrough in the Confederate line the following day, forcing the Confederate government as well as Lee's army to flee Richmond. Pickett and the last remnants of his command marched west with the rest of the army. At Sailor's Creek, in a stand against the approaching Federals, Pickett's division broke as well as other Confederate forces, giving the Union another victory. Shortly before making it to Appomattox Courthouse, Lee relieved Pickett of command, but he never left. Some say he never received the order, and others say he received it but refused to obey the order. Nevertheless, when Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse and the men were being paroled, Lee saw Pickett and asked, "Is that man still with this army?" Following his parole, Pickett went back to Richmond to be with Sally. She had remained behind when the army left. They were destitute. Pickett had been in uniform for 25 years, knowing no other occupation. His family home was in ashes, so he and Sally moved in with her family. On June 1st, he sent an application in to President Andrew Johnson, looking for a pardon. He claimed that if Virginia had not seceded, then he would have stayed with the old army, and that he loved the United States and hated to let go of that army. He became horrified when he found out that he was being investigated for war crimes for his actions in North Carolina. Fearing for his life, he, Sally, and George Jr. moved to Canada. They rented a room in Montreal, and to get by they borrowed money from family and other exiled Confederates. Sally allegedly sold her jewelry and taught Latin to help provide for the family. Pickett was ill and was mostly confined to his bed while in Canada. While the Picketts were there, friends and family went to the President and Grant to obtain a pardon for the general, but none of them succeeded. Grant believed that tempers hadn't cooled enough for Pickett's pardon. In December 1865, the Picketts moved back to Virginia, hoping they could regain some type of normalcy. On March 12, 1866, Pickett wrote to his West Point friend Ulysses S. Grant personally to ask for a pardon. The plea must have seemed genuine to Grant because on the day he received the letter, he sent an endorsement to President Johnson to look over the incident in North Carolina. Johnson would hold the request for a few more months, though. No charges would be brought against Pickett. It appears that Grant's endorsement succeeded. Still, Pickett would not receive a personal pardon. His pardon would come in December 1868 in Johnson's general amnesty. Pickett built a small cottage for his family near the ruins of his family's plantation house. He wrote, "Everything has been swept clean by the ruthless war: houses, dwellings, barns, stables, ice house, and slave quarters. Fences, of course, and every fruit or ornamental tree, vineyard, and shrubs and flowers." He found he wasn't gifted as a farmer and resorted to selling insurance for a New York-based company with an office in Norfolk. Although he became the president of the Southern Historical Society and helped to organize the Association of the Army of Northern Virginia, he wasn't outspoken about his time in the war. According to his wife, he didn't want to fight the battles over again. George Pickett still brooded about his failed charge at Gettysburg. As Robert E. Lee became the patron saint of the fallen Confederacy, Pickett continued to nurse his resentment toward his former commander. Pickett saw Lee again, briefly and accidentally, in a Richmond hotel. John Singleton Mosby, who witnessed the strained exchange between two officers, recalled that Lee was capable of freezing out a man he did not like. As Pickett left, he allegedly remarked to Mosby, "He had my division massacred at Gettysburg." Mosby sharply replied, "Well, it made you immortal." As the story goes, reporters asked Pickett why the charge at Gettysburg failed, and he would reply, "Well, I think the Yankees had something to do with it." Pickett and Sally welcomed another son into the world in these post-war years. They named him Corbell, Sally's maiden name. Pickett despaired over not being able to provide a more comfortable life for his family. He knew that Sally had come from a better home than he could now provide for her. In a letter to a family member, he was so distraught over the situation, he wrote, "I am a child." This statement indicated that he felt powerless to help his own situation. Pickett hoped to regain some glory and hoped for a foreign war to restore him. If Grant should inaugurate a new foreign policy and get the general attention diverted from the woolly head by a skirmish with something outside, why then we may hope for peace at home, and some of us may get occupation abroad. In the spring of 1874, their youngest son, Corbell, died of measles. The next year, 1875, Pickett fell ill while on business in Norfolk from what was called gastric fever. As he lay dying, he said, "I do not want anybody but my wife." The room was cleared, and he passed away. He was 50 years old. He initially was buried in Cedar Grove Cemetery in Norfolk, but disinterred later that year to be reburied in Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond. During the reburial, it was said 40,000 people lined the streets to watch the funeral procession, which contained 5,000 people. Sally, although hindered by health problems, long outlived her husband, keeping his name alive by writing numerous works and attending reunions, where she recounted his heroic deeds. Her works seem to be mostly fictional, and it's difficult to understand what is truth and what is fiction as historians sift through the material. Sally kept in touch with her husband's half-Native American son on the West Coast, staying in communication with him for 15 years. James Tilton Pickett never saw his father after Pickett left to fight in the war in 1861. James was a talented artist, attending the San Francisco School of Design. He would eventually work at the Seattle Post-Intelligencer and the Portland Oregonian. George Jr. went to meet his half-brother, but the interaction didn't go well. George Jr. apparently didn't care for the interracial status of his half-brother and made a derogatory comment about it to James, which resulted in their meeting being anything but cordial. Sally never did recognize James publicly, but signed her letters, "Your love and your devoted mother," as well as calling him son. She never got to meet him because her health prevented her from making the journey. James would die of tuberculosis at the age of 31 in 1889. Sally continued to promote her husband throughout her life, never remarrying. She died on March 22, 1931, in Rockville, Maryland. George Pickett gained immortality because of a defeat turned into an iconic moment by his wife, who sought to keep his name alive. Pickett never got over the loss. It signaled an important and depressing moment in his life. Gone were the days of aggression and courage. He felt abandoned by the army he loved. Did Pickett rise above his own abilities? Many of his biographers and historians of the war believe it to be true. Even his own biographers admit to his ineptness at command. One wrote, "Pickett habitually left his division command to visit his lover, This was someone who repeatedly held a distorted view of his responsibilities and the threats he faced. In the immediate aftermath at Gettysburg, Pickett was so consumed with his own grief that he wandered about the field aimlessly, sobbing openly. Throughout the Civil War and his entire military career, he proved to be an officer unwilling to admit error or take responsibility for his own actions. At New Bern and Gettysburg, Pickett lashed out at others for his own mistakes, and Five Forks was no different. In his report, he reproached Lee for failing to send reinforcements and criticized him for choosing Five Forks rather than a position behind Hatcher's Run. Pickett even blamed his lunch partner, Fitz Lee, for failing to protect the left flank. This was probably the same sort of unproductive and unprofessional complaining with which Pickett filled his infamous loss report from Gettysburg. Pickett's temper got the best of him in many situations, including his pre-war station in the Northwest at San Juan Island. He held grudges against Robert E. Lee and hastily blamed others instead of looking at his own responsibilities. As a brigade commander, Pickett was aggressive and capable. Utilized at the correct moment, he could hold on to a position despite overwhelming odds against him. His wounding put him on the sidelines during some of the most defining moments of the war for the Army of Northern Virginia, the Second Battle of Manassas, and the Battle of Antietam. When the Army was reorganized, he was made a division commander and never fully acquired the capability of managing a division in combat. He wasn't engaged at Fredericksburg, and during Longstreet's expedition to Suffolk, Pickett spent more time at Sally's than with his own division. By the time the Union and the Confederacy met at Gettysburg, Pickett was horribly inexperienced as a division commander, and despite his excitement, he wasn't prepared. As said before, Pickett's charge changed the namesake of the attack, and not for the better. He carried it with him into his post-war life. He struggled to make ends meet, and it seemed as though his life felt unfulfilled. Nonetheless, he gained immortality because of his wife's efforts to keep his name alive. It was partly because of her that Pickett's charge bears her husband's name. Despite two other divisions taking part in the attack, Pickett's command stood out because Virginians were highly revered in the post-war years because of the leaders who became canonized, like Lee and Stonewall Jackson. Unfortunately for Pickett, he will always be remembered for two Civil War moments, none of them flattering to himself: the failed attack at Gettysburg, and his dereliction of duty at Five Forks by attending a shad bake instead of seeing to his troops. George Pickett's legacy remains a complex blend of military valor and tragic miscalculation, forever tied to the ill-fated charge at Gettysburg that bore his name. Despite his post-war struggles and controversial reputation, he is remembered as a symbol of the Confederacy's fleeting hopes and ultimate defeat. The famed Southern author William Faulkner added to the Pickett's charge mythology in his own work, Intruder in the Dust. For every Southern boy 14 years old, not once, but whenever he wants it, there is the instant when it's still not yet 2 o'clock on that July afternoon in 1863. The brigades are in position behind the rail fence, the guns are laid and ready in the woods, and the furled flags are already loosened to break out, and Pickett himself, with his long old ringlets, and his hat in one hand probably, and his sword in the other, looking up the hill waiting for Longstreet to give the word, and it's all in the balance. It hasn't happened yet. It hasn't even begun yet. It not only hasn't begun yet, but there is still time for it not to begin against that position and those circumstances, which made more men than Garnett and Kemper and Armistead and Wilcox look grave, yet it's going to begin. We all know that. We have come too far with too much at stake, and that moment doesn't need even a 14-year-old boy to think this time, maybe this time, with all this much to lose and all this much to gain. Pennsylvania, Maryland, the world, the Golden Dome of Washington itself to crown with desperate and unbelievable victory the desperate gamble, the cast made 2 years ago. If you like what I do, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already, join the Patreon page, and purchase something from one of my online stores. Every little bit helps. Thank you.